Picking up strangers on the road can seem like a kind gesture, but sometimes, it leads to experiences that are far from ordinary. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories of people who offered rides to strangers, only to end up questioning their decisions. These are real accounts of car rides that took a terrifying turn, leaving the driver shaken and with questions that still haunt them. Buckle up, because these stories will make you think twice before stopping for someone in the dead of night. My name is Ethan, and this happened to me a couple of years ago while I was on a road trip across the country. I had been driving for hours, the sun was setting, and I was on a quiet stretch of highway that cut through miles of farmland. It was one of those roads where you could go for miles without seeing another car or even a house. I hadn't planned for how long this leg of the trip would take, so I was running low on gas and starting to feel the fatigue setting in. That's when I saw him. On the side of the road, a man stood next to his car, holding a sign that simply said, "Need a ride." His car looked broken down, it was tilted slightly, like the axle was busted, and there were no lights on. Normally, I wouldn't stop for a stranger, but he looked desperate, and I felt bad leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down and pulled up next to him. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a worn-out jacket and jeans. He didn't look particularly threatening, but something about his posture seemed off. Still, I rolled down the window and asked, "You need help?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, my car's dead, and there's no service out here. Just need a ride to the next town." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and let him in. He didn't have any bags, just his phone in his hand, which he kept checking compulsively even though he'd said there was no signal. As we drove, the silence in the car grew heavier. I tried making small talk, asking where he was headed and what had happened to his car. His answers were short, almost rehearsed. "Going home. Car just stopped working." After a few minutes, I stopped trying to talk and focused on the road. But then I noticed something strange. He kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, like he was studying me. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. About 15 minutes into the drive, he suddenly asked, "You travel alone a lot?" The question caught me off guard. I shrugged. "Sometimes." He nodded slowly, then muttered, "Brave." At that point, I started to regret picking him up. I kept my eyes on the road, hoping the next town would come into view soon. But the highway stretched on, and the GPS wasn't showing anything nearby. Then he started humming. It wasn't a tune I recognized, just this low, uneven hum that seemed to get louder the longer it went on. I asked if he was okay, and he just smiled at me, a thin, almost mechanical smile, and said, "Yeah, I'm fine." When I glanced down at his hands, I noticed they were clenched into fists on his lap. That's when I made up my mind. I needed to get him out of the car. I told him I had to pull over to check something in the trunk, and he just stared at me for a moment before nodding. As soon as I stopped, I grabbed my phone and pretended to check it, hoping he'd get out of the car to stretch or something. Instead, he just sat there, watching me through the rearview mirror. I walked to the back of the car and acted like I was inspecting something. My heart was racing as I debated what to do. Finally, I made up an excuse. "Hey, I think I left my wallet back at the gas station. I can't take you any farther, but there's another town about 10 miles ahead. Shouldn't take long for another car to come by." His expression changed. For the first time, he looked angry, no, furious. He got out of the car slowly, slamming the door behind him. "You shouldn't pick up people if you can't follow through," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. I didn't respond. I just got back in the car and drove off as fast as I could. A few miles down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that sent chills down my spine. He was standing in the middle of the highway, watching my car disappear into the distance. I didn't sleep well that night. My name is Lucas, and this happened when I was driving back home after visiting a friend in another state. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was on a long stretch of road surrounded by dense forest. The kind of road where your high beams barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow feels alive. I had been driving for hours and was eager to get home, but I was also tired. That's probably why I stopped when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought she might have been in an accident. Her clothes were disheveled, and she looked like she'd been crying. She waved at me as I slowed down, and despite every instinct telling me to keep driving, I pulled over. She approached the car, and I rolled down the window just a bit. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" Something about her story didn't add up. There were no signs of a car anywhere on the road, and she wasn't carrying a phone or a bag. But it was cold outside, and I couldn't leave her there. "Sure," I said reluctantly. "Hop in." She got into the passenger seat, thanking me over and over. I noticed her hands were shaking, but she didn't seem cold, more like she was nervous. As we drove, she didn't say much, which only made things more awkward. I tried asking her where she was headed, but her answers were vague, like she didn't want to give me too much information. "What about your car?" I asked. "Do you need to call someone to tow it?" She shook her head quickly. "No. It's fine. I'll handle it later." Her tone was sharp, like she didn't want to talk about it. I decided to drop the subject and focus on the road. But then I started noticing things that didn't sit right. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, as if she was expecting to see something, or someone, behind us. Every few minutes, she'd ask, "Are you sure no one's following us?" "No one's there," I assured her, but her anxiety was starting to make me uneasy. Then came the sound. It started as a faint tapping, like something hitting the back of the car. At first, I thought it might be a loose piece of metal or debris from the road, but the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah. Probably just something stuck under the car." But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The tapping stopped for a few moments, and then there was a loud thud, like someone, or something, had slammed against the trunk. She screamed, and I swerved slightly before regaining control of the car. "What the hell was that?" I shouted, my heart pounding. "Just keep driving," she yelled, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't argue. I floored the gas, desperate to put as much distance between us and whatever was causing that noise. After a few tense minutes, the road opened up, and I spotted the lights of a gas station ahead. "We're stopping here," I said firmly. She didn't protest. As soon as I parked, she jumped out of the car, pacing nervously while I checked the trunk. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, half expecting to find, I don't know what. But there was nothing. No dents, no scratches, nothing to explain the noises we'd heard. When I turned back to her, she was already on the phone, speaking hurriedly to someone. I caught bits and pieces of her conversation, something about them finding her and needing to disappear. I didn't ask questions. She thanked me again, said she'd wait at the gas station for someone to pick her up, and then she was gone. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night, who or what was following her, or if it was all in her head. But I haven't picked up another hitchhiker since. My name is Nathan, and this happened during a late-night drive back from a family gathering in the mountains. I had taken the scenic route, a winding, two-lane road cutting through dense forest. It was beautiful during the day, but at night, it felt suffocating. The trees closed in on both sides, and the only light came from my headlights. About halfway through the drive, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the road, illuminated by my high beams. It was a man, waving his arms frantically, trying to flag me down. His car was parked on the shoulder a few feet away, its hazard lights blinking weakly. I slowed down, rolling down my window just enough to hear him. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "My car won't start, and I don't have service. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" He looked normal enough, probably in his late 30s, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. They were darting around, like he was checking for something in the trees. "Where are you headed?" I asked. He pointed down the road. "There's a gas station about 10 miles from here. I just need to call someone to pick me up." I hesitated, but the thought of leaving someone stranded out here didn't sit right with me. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. "Thanks," he muttered, climbing in quickly. As we started driving, he kept looking over his shoulder, out the back window. I tried to make small talk, but he wasn't interested. His answers were curt, and his hands were clenched tightly in his lap. About 5 minutes into the drive, he suddenly said, "Can you go faster?" I glanced at him, confused. "Why? What's the rush?" He didn't answer, just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The tension in the car was suffocating, and I was starting to regret picking him up. Then, out of nowhere, he blurted, "Did you see them back there?" "See who?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "The people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been following me since my car broke down." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What people?" There was no one there. He shook his head. "They're out there. In the woods. Watching." I wanted to pull over and let him out right then, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and the thought of being alone on this road was somehow even worse. A few minutes later, he leaned forward, staring intently at the side mirror. "There," he shouted, pointing. I glanced at the mirror, my heart pounding, but all I saw was darkness. "There's nothing there, man. You're imagining things." "No," he insisted. "I saw them. They're keeping up with the car." I stepped on the gas, desperate to get to the gas station as quickly as possible. The man was breathing heavily now, muttering to himself. When the gas station finally came into view, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I pulled into the parking lot and told him, "This is as far as I'm going." He didn't argue. He got out of the car, but before closing the door, he leaned in and said, "Be careful on your way back. They don't like to lose track of people." Without another word, he walked into the gas station. I didn't stick around to see what happened next, I just wanted to get home. To this day, I don't know if he was crazy or if there was something out there that night. All I know is that I never take that road after dark anymore. My name is Marcus, and I'll never forget the night I decided to help a stranger in need. It was around 2 a.m., and I was driving home from a late shift. The highway was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person awake in the world. The darkness stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional flicker of my headlights catching on roadside markers. That's when I saw him, a man standing next to a beat-up car on the shoulder. His hood was up, and he was waving me down. At first, I thought about driving past. Something about stopping in the middle of the night on an empty road didn't sit right with me. But the guy looked desperate, and guilt got the better of me. I pulled over a few feet ahead of his car. He jogged up to my window, looking relieved. "Thank you," he said, out of breath. "My car won't start, and my phone's dead. Can you give me a ride to the next rest stop? It's only a few miles." I hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right. Get in." As he climbed into the passenger seat, I noticed he was carrying a small backpack. It wasn't unusual, but the way he clutched it tightly made me curious. Still, I didn't ask questions. We drove in silence for a few minutes before I tried to make conversation. "Rough night, huh?" He nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, he stared out the window, his hand gripping the strap of his bag like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The rest stop wasn't far, but something about the drive felt off. Maybe it was the tension in the car or the way he kept glancing at the rearview mirror, like he was expecting someone to show up. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You need to take the next exit." I frowned. "The rest stop isn't for another mile." "Please," he insisted, his voice shaking. "Just take the exit." Reluctantly, I complied, turning off onto a smaller, darker road. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The highway had been unsettling enough, but this road felt downright sinister. The trees were so thick they formed a tunnel, and my headlights barely pierced the darkness. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, peering into the darkness ahead. Finally, he muttered, "They're following me." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Who's following you?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said, his voice barely audible. Before I could respond, there was a loud thud against the back of the car. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They're here," he whispered, clutching his bag tighter. "Just keep driving." Against my better judgment, I did as he said, accelerating down the narrow road. The thudding continued, sporadic but deliberate, like something, or someone, was trying to get in. Suddenly, he shouted, "Stop the car." "What? Are you crazy?" "Just stop," he yelled, reaching for the wheel. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. He threw open the door, clutching his bag, and ran into the woods without another word. I sat there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered going after him, but the oppressive darkness of the forest made the decision for me. I wasn't about to risk my life chasing after a stranger. After a few minutes, I drove off, leaving him and whatever was out there behind. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something I didn't understand. To this day, I wonder what was in that bag, and what, or who, he was running from. Offering a ride to a stranger is an act of kindness, but as these stories show, it can sometimes lead to unsettling encounters that stay with you forever. Whether it's an eerie silence, a cryptic remark, or the feeling that you're not alone on the road, these moments remind us of the unpredictability of human nature. So, the next time you're driving down an empty road and see someone waving for help, you might want to think twice. Stay safe, and thanks for watching.